In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can use Final Gather together with high dynamic range images to create image-based lighting within 3ds Max. Alright, so here's a render of the scene that we are going to be working with. And you can see really just a very simple setup. We have no Final Gather, no global illumination, really just a few teapots with a architectural material on there. I'll talk about these architectural materials a little bit later in this training kit, but what we want to talk about right now is the process of using a high dynamic range image to actually derive color and lighting information during our Final Gather process. So to do this, let's actually build sort of a dome that we can use as our environment. So I'll go to something like a top view, go to our primitive creation, and let's just use a sphere for this. And we'll drag this out and make sure it encompasses our entire scene. Alright. So once we have that, now let's make a new material to actually drop on here, and this is going to be the basis of our image-based lighting. So with our ambient diffuse color, we'll go ahead and just set both of those to black. What we want to concentrate on, though, is this self-illumination color. So for this, let's plug in a bitmap. And if you take a look inside the Scene Assets /Images directory inside your Mental Ray project that's included on this disk, you should see an HDR image called Digital Tutor's Office. Alright, so this is a high dynamic range image, a 32-bit floating point image. Now when we bring this in, we want to make sure that the internal storage is set to use the real pixel data, all 32-bit information. So let's make sure real pixels is turned on, press OK, and let's go ahead and now just make sure that this has been assigned to the sphere. And let's take a quick render at what we have now. Okay, still really nothing to see, and what we need to do is make sure in this material that we have back in the default material, we'll actually just go ahead and rename this something like environment, and we just need to make sure that this two-sided checkbox is turned on, otherwise we won't see any kind of information because we're looking at the inside of the sphere. We could also just reverse the normals on this sphere if we wanted to. Alright, so you can see now we pretty much have a reflection that we have on these teapots. Go ahead and maximize this. So we have a little bit of reflection right now, but really nothing on the level of what we would call image-based lighting. So let's come in and start to add a little bit more to this. Let's take our render settings, our render setup. Let's go back to the Indirect Illumination tab, and we'll just enable Final Gather and take a render at what we have now. So now what it should be able to do is look at some of the high dynamic range data that's contained inside this image and use that to basically project this light down on our surface. Basically the exact same thing that we were doing with our Final Gather example when we had the little light plane. Except with this, we're actually using an image to control the color of the light that's coming in. Alright, so let's come in and let's just minimize one of these windows. Right now we're actually getting a lot of direct illumination because we do have our default light that's in the scene as well as this image-based lighting. So to override that, we can just add a standard Omni light or something like that. Put it up here, and let's select that. Go to the Modify, and we'll just give it a very, very low intensity. There are some times where you may want to get some direct lighting in here from some kind of a direct illumination source, but a lot of times when it comes to image-based lighting, you're going to want to try to have most of this lighting information come from the actual image itself. Alright, so here we go. We actually now have a little bit of directionality from this because you can see a lot of our light, according to the image that we have wrapped around, is actually sort of coming from this direction, kind of from our skylight. Alright. So you can see looking at this, though, that it looks like our teapots are actually sort of floating up above the surface. You can see that it really is not looking like these are grounded very well. So what we need to do is come back and probably adjust some of our Final Gather settings. So let's go back to the render setup, go to our Indirect Illumination tab. We probably need to start by increasing this point density. The higher this number goes, the more accurate our result is going to be. So let's try something like 0.3. We'll start with that. And maybe just for comparison's sake, just so we don't have to re-render this entire image, let's come in and actually grab our little manipulator here. And we'll set this to a region. And whenever we re-render that, now we can just re-render this small little portion. It does one of two things. It, number one, saves us a little bit of time when it comes to rendering, and number two, we can actually see a pretty good comparison of what we had before versus what we have now with some of these settings we're starting to make. So we're on the right track. We have a little bit higher density. Probably even start to take this up a little bit higher. And let's also start to dial up some of the number of rays as well. Now keep in mind that as we start to take this number higher and higher, that our renders are going to start to slow down a bit. So just as long as you keep that in mind. Alright, so let's go ahead and now set this back to view and re-render this. I'm just going to pause this one while it renders because this is going to take just a moment. Alright, and now we have these shadows that are starting to look much, much better. Now, again, kind of as I mentioned in our earlier Final Gather lesson, we could actually come in, rather than trying to increase the number of Final Gather rays and the Final Gather points to try to capture some of its detail, especially around these bottom areas where we are still getting just a little bit of floating. What we could actually do is use something like an ambient occlusion pass that could be composited back over, and again, we will talk about that a little bit later. Now, looking at this, our render is a little bit on the dark side. Now, what we could do is maybe try to increase the number of Final Gather bounces, but we could also take advantage of the exposure controls that are built directly into the renderer. So if we go to our environment and effects, that's going to be this button right here. If we take a look under the exposure control, if we're going to be using mental ray, we can utilize the mental ray photographic exposure. Now, looking at a lot of these values, you may not know exactly what is going to be happening. Basically, these are all corresponding to camera functions, so your camera's shutter speed, aperture, and film speed. Now, rather than actually trying to make adjustments to these and then render to see what your result is, these are actually computed after the render happens. And this becomes especially important whenever you're using something like a high dynamic range image that actually contains more color information than what can be displayed on our monitor. Mental Ray can use all of that information, but it really can't display it back on your monitor. Our monitors are still only an 8-bit medium. So what we can do is use the exposure controls to compress that 32-bit information into something 8-bit that we really can see. Now, this becomes a lot easier if we use something like this little render preview to actually take a look at this. So right now we just have a black, dark image. Now what we can do is start to take some of these shutter speed adjustments and some of the aperture as well and actually make alterations to this and see those changes happen right here in this little preview window. So we can start to dial up maybe the intensity, maybe start to brighten this up a little bit more or even darken it, whatever the case may be. And you can see as we start to make these adjustments, they're displayed right here in this little preview, and this happens much, much faster than just trying to kind of manually come in and make this work as best you can. So we can brighten this up, and I'm just kind of eyeballing this until we get a result that is acceptable. Now once we have this and everything is set, now we can come back and re-render, and these render settings should be applied to our main render. There we go, and now you can see how really this is now taking all of this 32-bit color data and compressing this down into an 8-bit color space so we can really see all the information that is contained here. And if you're going to be rendering out in a 32-bit format like an HDR format or an EXR format, you really don't need to worry about these exposure controls. You could go through the same process in your compositing package, but if you're going to be rendering out to a low dynamic range format, something like a TIFF or a Targa, you will probably want to take your high dynamic range image and use something like the exposure control to compress all that data into an 8-bit image that can easily be read. You can see really how this now makes the image look much, much warmer and overall a little bit more realistic than what we had before. So that's a look at how we can start to do image-based lighting together with these exposure controls to start to get some really, really nice results with really very little effort.